So it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Allegra Baiocchi to all of you. She is the resident coordinator of the United Nations in Costa Rica, and she has always been very kind and grateful to us by delivering this session in this course on UN system, but others as well. I mean, she's been a guest lecturer in some of our courses previously, and we are extremely grateful. As you will see, she is very experienced in the system and has a wealth of knowledge that I hope you all will pick on. And please do make time for the question and answer session to, just delve deeper into some of these themes that she'll be discussing today. And the topic, of course, as you know, that we have requested her to speak about today is the UN system and the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So, Allegra, the floor is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you. See you later. Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to meet you. Allegra, as you've heard, this is my third year, I think, teaching this class. It's incredible every year to see how different this class looks. And I'm also going to try to do it a little. I'm also learning every time I do it to try and do it a little different. So I was asked to talk about UN system and a 2030 sustainable agenda. Now, I know you guys have been studying the UN, so you probably know the theory more than I. So what I really wanted to do today is maybe with you, and so I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions, to just look at what does it all mean and how does the UN actually work in practice in a country, and in this case, in Costa Rica. So who is a resident coordinator? So every country now has a resident coordinator, and there was a reform, maybe it was in your notes a few years ago, that kind of strengthened the role of the UN resident coordinator. And I don't know, I would describe it as the ambassador of the Secretary General, kind of the emissary of the UN. So there's definitely a political role, which is to represent UN on all issues. And then there's the second part, which is the title, coordination. And if you have studied the UN, then you would have looked, maybe you would have seen at something that looks like this, scary, which is all the different bits and pieces of the UN. So it just gives you a picture of how diverse, how complex, and definitely how complicated the UN can be. And so you have to imagine that all of this is at work all the time. All the time, UN is producing from every single piece of this graph. And there will be some pieces of this that will be in country. And every country looks different. That's also the trickier part. It's not like there's a set UN in country. The makeup of a UN country teams, they're actually called, will be different based obviously on the country. So that piece usually comes out of here, the specialized agencies. And then you will have the programs and funds that are up there, and then a bit of secretariat. And then, of course, if a country is a peacekeeping country, then you'll have obviously a great peacekeeping operation. Sometimes you'll have regional centers. Panama is a regional center. Dakar is a regional center. Nairobi is a regional center. And there you'll see more regional agencies. So my role is to make everything that we have in country fit together, but also to see what other parts of this big picture Costa Rica needs. So sometimes Costa Rica needs, obviously, as you know, Costa Rica is very big on environment. Just turns out that we don't have the environmental agency of the UN here in Costa Rica, which would be UNEP. So my job is to reach out to UNEP and say, we need you for this, we need you for that. Can you come and find a way that the expertise of UNEP can support Costa Rica? I wanted to go back to this, though, because I think maybe like you, this is a time where we tend to ask a lot, what is the UN good for? And I also ask myself 27, 8 years, I don't know, nearly 30, working in the UN. Actually, I ask myself all the time. And I think it is an important question. And we need to keep asking ourselves, if you look at the UN, if you work in the UN, because the only way that you will get some job satisfaction is that you keep asking yourself and trying to find that answer. And there's moments that it's really difficult right now. So when I was thinking of how to have this conversation with you today, I actually just Googled, I think this is Bing. What is the UN? Because sometimes, when we think so much of all the different things and we're trying to bring it down, but concretely, what is the UN? So I looked for this definition, and then I tried to think, okay, in my day to day here in Costa Rica, how does this apply? And so, of course, intergovernmental, and we'll go back to that. You've read this many, many times. It's it's made of member states, and this is one fundamental thing you will always have to think when you think UN. There is an organization that's the UN, but ultimately, like any kind of private sector company, what the UN does and doesn't do is determined by stakeholders, and member states are major stakeholders because they get a vote. So always remember it's an intergovernmental organization with a purpose, and so peace and security, obviously human rights, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development, which is what we're going to talk about a little more today. Climate action, which has really picked up in recent years, and uphold, big word, international law. So if I just think of me here in Costa Rica, the concrete version of all of this. Okay, obviously Costa Rica is going through a security crisis. We have a lot of engagement with the Ministry of Security talking about what's going on and what strategies Costa Rica should be looking at to try and address it. How do we do? Because we have experts that work in different organizations, but also because we do this in a lot of other countries. So what a UN person will usually do is think, where else? Where else have we helped a country? Where else can I bring a lesson to Costa Rica on this issue? Protect human rights. Yeah, last night I was with the human rights ambassador of a European country who's visiting Costa Rica and then will go to Guatemala. And basically I had to make a presentation. What's going on in human rights in Costa Rica? That's an effort in advocacy. That's an effort in pointing out, where are the issues? We talked about minority rights. We talked about migration issues. We talked about how we need stronger voices on human rights, etc. Deliver humanitarian aid. Absolutely. Costa Rica is one of the countries that is on the migration route. If you follow the news, you will have seen maybe some pictures of how people move out of the Darien in Colombia, but also how they pass through Costa Rica. And in the last 6 months, we've mounted a pretty sizable for Costa Rica humanitarian operation that is in the south, that's in the north. It's actually also here in San Jose when you see all the Venezuelan families coming around, to provide aid and to provide aid, but also to advocate for aid. So we could deliver aid, but we're also asking other partners to provide aid, and we're also trying to uphold standards. There needs to be dignity in providing aid. These, people need to have information. People need to have their rights respected. That is happening now in Costa Rica. Sustainable development, obviously, it's the core of what we do in a country like Costa Rica. Climate action. And then, upholding international law. Yes, that underpins everything we do, not to the extent that we are advocating for the respect of international humanitarian law right now in the Middle East, but we do have conversations around law, for example, on refugees. I don't know if you know, Costa Rica is, I think, still the fourth country of asylum globally, obviously percentage-wise. That's because it has over 200,000 Nicaraguan refugees and asylum seekers. With this new administration, we had to go back to the basics and remind them, what are refugee rights? How does a country uphold the right of asylum? And then there's definitely, the conversation around international humanitarian law. Okay, we talked about this. Okay, and so my third, probably my last part in terms of substance is sustainable development, which is kind of an Agenda 2030. Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and I put her, I will finish with the Secretary General, but I put her because she actually leads the Sustainable Development Agenda in the UN. The Secretary General is more the political, the good offices, and all the work around. Well, she actually joined the UN to work on Millennium Development Goals, and then was one of the developers, let's say, creators of the Sustainable Development Goals all along. And again, now leads it because she chairs something in the UN that's called UN Sustainable Development Group. And so maybe I'll read it. Okay, I just wanted to pick up this. There's many things written. Obviously, I could have chosen any sentence, but I found that this one has really elements that are really important for you to take into account. Okay, unprecedented in scope. So never before, when it comes to development, the UN had tried to cover all of it. And again, that's a big change from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. This is all encompassing. The 17 SDGs cover everything. And as it says at the end, they're integrated and indivisible. It's accepted by all countries and is applicable to all. Now, this is really something we go back to all the time in real life, because when the UN puts out things, they tend to become a UN thing. And so when you work with countries, reminding them that there's no such thing as a UN thing. Everything that's UN, it's a member state thing. As I said before, because we're a member state organization. So I find myself regularly reminding Costa Rica, actually, the SDGs is not ours, it's yours. You agreed, you developed them. It was a member state process. They sat in a room for years and decided, 17, which 17? Where are the indicators? What are the targets? So it's therefore created by them, accepted by them, applicable to all. Now, of course, every single country around the world has a different development trajectory. No two countries are in the same development point. And that's the tricky part about the SDGs. But the first thing we were told about SDGs is you actually have to nationalize them. Now, for those who have been in Costa Rica more, here you say tropicalize them, because these global goals need to make sense for each and every country. And so that's actually work we did with the Ministry of Planning, which was, let's look at these goals, this big agenda 2030, and see where you are today on every single goal. Oh, you have to get to zero poverty. Where are you now? You have to get to zero hunger. Where are you now? Except jobs, climate, water, infrastructure, industry, all of it. And we now actually have a document that is exactly that. It's the national plan for Costa Rica with its own national targets. Well, as it says, because we have to take into account different national realities, capacities, level of development, and respect national policies. And this is really an important point for us. Everything we do as UN has to be in support of, nationally led. And nationally led doesn't always mean government led, and we can talk about it a little later. But when it comes to development plans, it's definitely what is the country's vision and how can I inform the country's vision, inspire the country vision by the SDGs. So the SDGs have to be an inspiration. Amongst them, ourselves, we call them the northern light, like the star. But at the same time, you also need to see, what does this country want to do? What does this government want to do? So when this government came in about 2 years ago, we had to go back and say, okay, what are your priorities, President Chavez, which were different from somebody called President Alvarado, who was before. And we have to rethink. And that's where the SDGs are so important, because in the momentary rethink, you say, but hold on, you signed the SDGs. So, whatever we do, we always have to be speaking to the SDGs. So universal goals and targets, which involve the entire world. And again, they are integrated and indivisible. So that is also a very important concept, because you cannot pick and choose your SDGs. You cannot say, oh, I'm going to do 5, but, I'm not so keen on 17, or, that's human rights, for example. No. You have to do all, because you can't achieve one if you haven't achieved all. So I'm not going to go into this if we want to talk about it later about MDGs and SDGs. But we tend to, if you've seen anything about SDGs, you usually see it like this, right? It's these little boxes. But in fact, they're actually more like this. And sometimes I think that's where the wheel comes out, because they're not standalone. They're all completely interconnected. And as you start working on any one of them, you will immediately see, well, I can't really get to quality education, if I have poverty, or if I have a huge debt, like in Costa Rica. These are real conversations that we have here all the time. And maybe, you've had also in class. Okay, so whose job is it? And so this is a little bit what I was talking about. Obviously, what is the role of the UN? The UN is to support, the UN is to cooperate. The leadership has to be national. Definitely has to be with the government. So we push a lot for the government to say, do you have a mechanism that follows the SDGs? Who is responsible? Who's the focal point? We do have that here in Costa Rica. But I wanted to put this up because one of the big messages about the SDGs is that it's actually everybody's job. So while the government definitely has a responsibility, no doubt about it, we're never going to get there if, for example, the private sector doesn't collaborate. It's a big part of achieving the SDGs. If you look at the SDGs that are around environment, infrastructure, consumption, I mean, it's very hard for the government to, what can the government do? Set out a policy, maybe put out a law, set boundaries and set targets, but the actual work, it's going to have to come from private sector. And I think actually private sector is a big absent actor when it comes to the SDGs. And a lot of the debate is in UN is how do we get private sector to act more? Academia, UPAS is an SDG champion, for example. The United Nations, as I said, donors, because one of the big conversations the UN is having right now is where is the money? We're not going to achieve these SDGs unless there's serious money on the table, which isn't there right now. So the SG has been very strong on calling for more money. He calls it an SDG stimulus. But he's also calling out the banks, World Bank, IMF, regional banks, to say, your system is broken and it's not really helping member states. So this, just now in September at the GA, there was a lot of conversations around a restructuring of the financing mechanisms and an active dialogue, let's say, with the World Bank and IMF. And government, we said it, United Nations, and I'll end with civil society. So important. And again, this was a little bit the conversation I was having yesterday with this human rights ambassador. I mean, he was saying, what can we do? And I said, ultimately, the best thing you can do is support human rights defenders, empower them so they can stand up for themselves. The best thing is that we support from behind and allow people to be asking for what is their right. And it's the same with sustainable development. So what we really need is a civil society that comes out and says, I deserve this, I deserve that. I want to get decent employment. I want to get decent infrastructure. I want to have quality education. And so the focus on civil society is super important. Unfortunately, it doesn't tend to be as strong as it should be. Okay, this is just some pictures in reality. So how does it all play out in Costa Rica? So this is something we have here that's called localizing the SDGs, which is our work with municipalities. So we have, Costa Rica has about 80 municipalities, and about half of them have signed up to a network of municipalities that will strive to reach the SDGs. So they get a flag, and there's a whole process called voluntary local reviews. Maybe you've studied them. They are the local version of voluntary national reviews, which is when countries give their scorecard on the SDGs. IAD, United Way, is a version of Global Compact, which maybe you've heard about. It's the private sector support. Up there, it's me signing with the National Assembly, their commitment to the SDGs. That's the logo of the Ministry of Justice, of the Poder Judicial, of the judiciary here in Costa Rica, that is also supporting the SDGs. That's civil society, Costa Rican civil society at a meeting. And so very quickly, a little bit of technical stuff. How do we ensure progress? I mentioned voluntary local reviews. We have voluntary national reviews. So countries say, okay, I'm ready to report on how I'm doing on the SDGs, and they will go to New York to a high-level political forum to present it. Actually, Costa Rica is doing it next year. Then we have statistics and data. There's a lot of data behind the SDGs. So we work with Institute of Statistics, and sometimes we do our own kind of analysis. and then global. So maybe if you've been studying the UN and the SDGs, you would have heard maybe that this year we did an SDG summit because we're at halfway, midpoint. And the whole UN is gearing up now for the Summit of the Future, which is going to happen next year. And I would call it maybe the SG's legacy. You know, the SG is in his second term, and I think he has 2 years to go. So we'll be soon talking about re-election and hoping there'll be a woman. But so his whole work, let's say in these 7-8 years, I know it's long, we'll look at it together, is going to be at the Summit of the Future, where, you know, he's been looking at very different topics and trying to get member states next year to sign what he calls a pact for the future. So I think this is my last slide, and I just cut it from a speech that the Secretary General just gave now in September at a member state briefing on the Summit for the Future. And I wanted to just, again, pick out some of the way it's written in a way and some of the points that he makes in it. And so, well, distinguished ministers, okay, I welcome your agreement. So this is the Secretary General speaking to member states. And I want to go back to the first point I made. It's a member state organization. So the Secretary General has an idea. This is totally his idea, the Pact for the Future. The topics were worked through a lot of consultation and conversations, but he's the shepherd, you know, he's the leader. But he won't go anywhere unless member states say, yeah, we want to do this. Yeah, we agree. So in this meeting, and usually the person that helps him get that agreement is the president of the General Assembly, right? Every year the General Assembly elects a president, and so he will work with that person. So I welcome your agreement that the Summit of the Future will adopt an intergovernmentally negotiated, so we don't know what it's going to look like because it's going to be a negotiation between member states, pact for the future. And the Pact for the Future is going to reaffirm the UN Charter, reinvigorate multilateralism, boost existing commitments, agree on solutions to new challenges. And I picked these out because these are the topics today. You know, nobody's denying there's a crisis of multilateralism. The Secretary General is the first person to accept there's a crisis of multilateralism. And he is very, you know, he's been actually opening that conversation, saying we need to talk about it. But he's also saying at the end, we will probably still need multilateralism. So there's a lot of speeches now of the SG saying in such a polarized world, we should avoid, you know, creating little clubs because that's not going to help us. What we really need is to fix the system of multilateralism. And so he mentions the charter, but also very much looking at solutions. And so he picks up, and you know, you'll have this because, I mean, ultimately this, to me, as somebody who represents the Secretary General, is kind of my homework. What do I have to work on as the UN resident coordinator? This is it. I have to work on those 5 basket of issues. And then these are some of the more specific, you know, axis, if you want, that he has developed. And so for each one of these, if you're particularly interested, there's a policy paper. So over the last 2 years, people, you know, have been sitting and thinking, oh, what are the big issues we need to fix globally? And then let's do a policy paper and put it out for reflection. And I think when I look at it, it's like, oh my gosh, stronger cooperation in outer space. Wow, we're really thinking ahead. Or maybe not. Maybe this is the issue now. And so my job now is to think, how does something that seems to me personally quite remote, I need to read it, I need to learn about it, but also how is this relevant? Why is this relevant? Why is this on this list? And then how does it apply to Costa Rica? But also, how do I make sure that Costa Rica as a member state supports this global agenda? So maybe just to make you understand that it's always kind of an up and down. It's not a center that comes down. It's maybe more like that SDG diagram where everybody feeds into itself, onto itself. I think I'm going to stop. Oh, okay. Well, I'll leave you with inspiring words of the Secretary General. It's actually not recent. This is from 2019. And I just thought I'd keep it Our world as we know it and the future we want are at risk in 2019. Imagine now. Despite considerable effort these past 4 years, we're not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We must dramatically step up the pace of implementation as we enter a decisive decade for people and the planet. And so this was as we were entering the decade for action, and then which was 20 to 30 basically, and now we're at midpoint. And the reason I didn't change it is because it's the same message now. We're still not on track. In fact, I think only about 30% of the SDGs are on track. And so if you had heard his message this year, it's basically very similar to this. That being said, not to leave you on a depressive note, it's not on track, but we're constantly saying, and this is what the message was at the GA, is it's still the track. It's not on track, but this is still the track. So let's get on track and let's work all the things that we need to get back on track. Thank you for listening. I wanted to stop here because usually what I enjoy about these classes is just questions. So not only on what I've said, obviously, on anything you've studied, on any doubts, issues, or dilemmas that you have on the UN. Yeah, I'm here. So anybody wants to start? And I'm going to look online. Yeah, nothing. Oh, you have a mic. Okay.
No quiero ser grabada, por favor. Gracias. I was just wondering, how do you choose? I noticed you had like a representative for civil society. How do you choose one person to represent civil society?
Should we take a few? Is there any other? We have colleagues in the room. Yay!
Hi, welcome to UPeace, Allegra.
Thank you.
As you know, I've been working on the localization with the office, and it's a very amazing process. Anyone who wants to talk to me about it, I'd love to share. But I'm writing my final graduation project on localization as it pertains to the 3 pillars of the UN system. So human rights, peace building, and
Development.
for some reason I can't think of it.
Development.
Yes, international development. And what I'm finding is these 3 sectors have kind of grown separately over time and use different language. And so I wonder like how that shows up in the coordination efforts of the office.
Okay, I'll take one more. I read it? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I can talk about it, we're good. Okay, so beautiful. He says, if I remember very well, the sustainable development issue came up in the 26-27 September conference in 2015. 8 years have gone by. How do you evaluate the realization of this initiative? Do you think it has been successful? And why are we still where we are today?
Okay, so thank you. Civil society, we don't choose. We support civil society to organize themselves in whichever shape or form, and they will choose. So, for example, here in Costa Rica, we have a kind of a committee, a working group around the SDGs, which is led by the vice president at the kind of top level, and then it has a working level piece. And in that, civil society came together as a coalition, and they've nominated somebody to sit at the technical level and at the higher level. So it's very much up to them. Now, when there are international meetings, then you'll say, okay, I have 2 slots, I have 3 slots, who can go? And then eventually, who has the opportunity to go, who has the money to pay. So there may be some selection at that point, but in terms of the actual organization, that should be totally up to them. And in fact, specifically here in Costa Rica, we've had an issue because we don't always feel that these umbrella organizations are as representative as they should be. And it's a bit of a double catch because you choose one and then you tend to have a conversation with that one and you're never sure how much that one is having that bigger conversation. So we try and monitor that as well. Localization and the division. No, absolutely. A big topic, maybe you've read it in some of your documents, is the nexus. which is all about bringing the pillars back. And and you said three. When you said three, I think I wonder which three she'll say, because the UN, right, it's split up in so many things. But one thing the SG has tried to do is kind of bring more pieces together. So if you looked at his early reforms, one of the big things that shook the UN secretary was bringing together political affairs and peacekeeping affairs, and just saying you guys should, you should be one. And I think we're making progress in pulling together the political, the political piece, the development, and the humanitarian, because that's another big divide: the humanitarian and development. Those are two different tribes that for many, many years we're trying to pull together. And then I think human rights, human rights is always tricky, and maybe you've seen it in other issues, because there's always the tension between, is it one unto itself or is it mainstreamed? And mainstream, that it should be everywhere. But then, is it everywhere or is it actually nowhere? And because human rights work is hard, it is hard. It depends on the countries, obviously. But even in a country like Costa Rica, it can be hard. It tends to be like, let me not get there. Let me not touch it. Let me just say it's mainstreamed everywhere. So I feel that that's the big call that we get from our human rights colleagues. No, wait a minute. Where are we? We want to be more central to this. So I really take the point. And I think you're right. If you look at the localization as we're doing it here, it's definitely development based, right? The big focus is the development side. So I think it's also a good comment. Thank you. Okay. SDG, no, I think it's what I was saying. No, why are we here? Why are we not on track? I think there's so many reasons, but there's definitely one that has been lack of commitment. Not all member states are so enthusiastic about the SDGs. There's actually a really growing anti-SDG agenda, very political. In Latin America, it's quite strong. I can show you videos of presidential candidates throwing, I don't know if it was a machete or a arrow, and the center is SDGs, and he says, "This is what I'm going to do to anyone who supports the SDGs." And we've seen it a little bit in Costa Rica. So the SDGs in some areas has become this super communist. You want to take away kind of my culture, my religious rights, etc., etc. So there's a philosophical reasons for some countries. I would say there's definitely, for me, if I had to put one name to it, I would put financing. We just need a lot more money to achieve them. And a lot of countries don't have money. If you look at Costa Rica, they really have a serious issue around financial restructuring, the debt. So there's not that much money to spend to get these extra things that we need for the SDGs. And then maybe the third, I would say, it's like definitely all the other parts. I mean, without private sector really coming in, as I said, it's going to be hard. I mean, we do have, these kind of impact investors, or there's a whole part of the business that now is very much into trying to do good, but it's not core. I mean, the business sector still wants to make a lot of money. And I think, until we see that shift, and until we, as consumers, also start expecting differently from our products and from the way we purchase, I think we're not going to see much of a shift. So we talk a lot about, obviously, everybody talks a lot about greenwashing, but recently we've coined the term UN washing, which is when a private sector comes to us and say, oh, let's do something together, and then maybe we could take a photo, or then maybe you can give me a logo or something, and there's no real change behind it. So that would be my answer. Okay, maybe these three. Okay, so we go this way then.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Mhm.
Well, first of all, thank you, Allegra, and good morning. I do have a question regarding finance, as we were talking that it's like a problem we're facing. So I'm curious if the national office has like a mechanism to quantify grants that come to the country under the umbrella of the SDGs, or that are SDG projects, because I think it will be very important, but also very difficult, not only at a governmental level, but also at the local governments, academia, NGOs, because now it's the international agenda. So it will be, I don't know, I have these questions. So.
Hello, Elena. Can you explain or speak more about the Poder Judicial de Costa Rica? Poder Judicial of Costa Rica in SDGs, what are they doing, and how judiciary can help to achieve the SDGs globally or generally?
I wonder how it would be possible for such a prestigious organization to achieve its sustainable goal when it itself divert from its basic purposes, like fail to perform, fail to give the humanity prosperity, justice, peace, security. And I think it's following the same step as what happened with the Millennium Sustainable Goals, because that goal was adopted, they failed to perform the word, failed to give the word security, because 9/11, Syria war, and in the same way now, the Ukraine war, and latestly the Gaza. The Security Council I think is not going to work, this prestigious organization, because when we imply the international law, give the rights, rights bring peace, peace leads prosperity to come, and we are just talking about the prosperity, and we have forget all the security and the peace. So how it would be possible without this?
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna start with the easy ones. So data. You were mentioning data. Oh, and the budgeting. Sorry. Yes, there are absolutely these tools. So they are for different sectors. So there isn't one big. Although some countries have tried something. And if you look at CEPAL, the work of the regional commissions, they tend to do a lot of work on that. But let's just look at the UN. For example, the UN now has a mechanism. It's called UN Info. You can look it online, which is for every country, and it's real-time data on what we are doing in a country. So it's like full transparency, and what we're doing is always associated to an SDG. So you can say, okay, this action is for this, or more than one, obviously, because of that graph we saw. And then, but the other important part is government spending. So one of the things we do with governments, we try and do with governments, and some have accepted, Costa Rica has, is to actually budget, if they look at their national budget, then associate it to the SDG. So you can see how much money is going to the different SDGs, and then you can track it over time. And then you can also do that for institutions. So even some individual institutions, like maybe a ministry, has also done that effort of saying, okay, this is my national budget, my yearly budget, and this is how it's SDG divided. It's not a perfect exercise. Definitely not a perfect exercise, but I think it can show where we're investing and where we're not, and what the gaps are, because that's the most important part, right? To see that, this money is needed and it hasn't come in. Yeah.
I do understand that, but regarding the... Well, first of all, thank you. That was very clarifying. But also, I was wondering regarding the inflows, like the international grants and funds that come to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have a mechanism.
There's well, we don't, because that's run by the Ministry of Planning.
Yes.
So the Ministry of Plan actually has a whole database. Most countries have it actually, where everything that is a project is there and the flow comes in. Now, what we don't have, and that's also potentially something we could look at, is see how that's SDG matching. Because maybe that's another part, there's even the member states that are, and maybe that speaks a little bit to why we're not there, or to the colleague before, is even the member states that, let's say, are the wealthy ones, haven't necessarily played along as much as they should have when it comes to the SDGs. So even today, we don't necessarily see the European Union, or I don't know, the US or the UK constantly saying, oh, this is for the SDGs. There's a lot of bilateral politics in flows, right? And you could see it if you even take a picture of what bilaterals are doing in Costa Rica, not all of it, but some of it, let's say, will be tied to national interest. That's always going to be the case. So it's not necessarily, where's the SDG priority for Costa Rica, but it's more, where's my priority with Costa Rica? The judiciary. Okay, when we ask these institutions to work on SDGs, okay, first of all, it could be, obviously there's the promotion of governance and the solid institutions. So there will be always an SDG that really is, core to that institution, and that's where the judiciary comes in. So in fact, if you're interested, please go on their website. They have a report. They come out every year with a report on how we're doing against the target. So similar to what I said about countries, every institution looks at the SDGs and says, what applies to me? And by the way, a lot of universities have done this as well, and that's also online. They take all the SDGs and say, okay, yes, I can speak to this, I can speak to this, and then they set their own plan. So some of it will be based on their work. So example, the judiciary in Costa Rica has a whole program of work with us and also with the Spanish for access to justice for indigenous people. So obviously there's an assessment that indigenous people do not have equal access to justice. So there was a lot of work done on why, and that was a lot of consultation going to every single territory of Costa Rica, indigenous territory, and sitting down with them saying, why? What is your, and it could be language, it could be, I don't know the laws, it could be fear, it could be discrimination, lots of different things. And then pulling a plan of action to try and fix it. So that's partly what I'm trying to say. The work is substantive, but there's also a second part that we often don't see, which is true of every institution, could be also true for UPAS, which is, sustainable practices. And what do I do with my trash? What do I do with the food of the canteen? Very practical things that sometimes we don't think about, but actually feed into the SDG. And so these institutions tend to also look at that procurement. Where do I buy how many of my cars are electric? Am I buying recycled paper? Am I printing double face? I know it's basic, but actually we need basic. We need everything. Okay, to that very, very complicated question. I mean, there's part of that I will challenge back to you because it's exactly what I said at the beginning. The UN is far from perfect. I'm not here to defend the UN. It's an institution that right now, well, maybe I am here to defend the UN, but we need to understand. When I hear people say that to me, and I hear it all the time, there's a part of me that says, sure, the Security Council is definitely not working. I don't know if that's the UN's fault or is it the fault of the Security Council member states. You blame the UN. The UN is the room. The UN is the process. It's who's sitting at that table. The UN is not sitting at a Security Council table. There's no UN seat. It's 5 member states and, okay, you guys know better, 10 or whatever other member states on rotation. So whose fault is it? Is sometimes what I feel when people say that. Can the institution be stronger? Absolutely. Can the Secretary General be stronger over the years? Not specifically. Although, let it be known. Right now, proud is not the right word, but if you read the news, right now, a lot of institutions are going through serious identity issues over the conflict in the Middle East. Maybe it's on the news, colleagues who work at the European Union, very frustrated, writing a letter saying, it's not acceptable. Similarly, in the US, people from State Department have quit their jobs, etc. And I read this and I think, wow, no, the Secretary General, every time I read a speech, every time I read his statements in, at the border crossing or, we're in Egypt, yeah, I agree with him. I feel he's saying the right thing. Are we getting it? No, but at least I have an organization where I can feel, okay, we're saying the right thing, which I consider a privilege right now, and I know that I have colleagues, I have friends actually in Gaza today under those bombs trying to get humanitarian assistance. Not many other institutions can say it. So I think we always need to separate the institution, which has a lot of issues for sure, to the actual member state willingness. The UN is never going to achieve what member states don't want it to achieve. And it's how I started. It's a member state organization. And that's why I think the SG is calling out the crisis, and it's calling out this division and polarization that we're seeing. And Middle East is just one. And yesterday, in this dinner, somebody said, oh, because now we have 2 wars. I said, no, we don't have 2 wars. We have way more than 2 wars. And that the world only thinks that we have 2 because they're only looking at Ukraine, and the Middle East is troubling. And I think that's also what the UN is there for, to say, no, sorry, the Sudan and, and the Syria and et cetera, et cetera. So I really agree with you. And I think the global frustration is necessary. Actually, I feel it's important that we get upset because it's only through this kind of anger that we are going to push for some better ways of working. But I personally, obviously you don't have to feel the same way. I still think that an institution like the UN is still needed. We just need to keep, and eventually, I mean, I think the UN in its history must have gone through many moments of very deep crisis. You know, we always talk about the Cold War and when nobody was speaking, and we're probably in that cycle again. But, and tomorrow is UN Day, by the way. So if you did, well, maybe you're celebrating it. And actually, I'm working on my speech. What am I going to say tomorrow in this very complicated situation? And there's something that is, I think it's a painting in the UN. If anybody's visited the Secretariat, it's a sentence anyway, which is, the UN wasn't created to take us to heaven. It was created to save us from hell. And this, to me, is that moment. Yes, we're not going to get peace. Maybe we're not even going to get that ceasefire that we've been asking, but we are going to try and help some people. That's it.
From Fidelis, he's asking, could you offer some insights on how the SDG 2030 is preparing to incorporate or rather to work with the emerging regional economic organizations like the BRICS and others to achieve a global development?
Mm-hmm.
Hi. So there are several sustainable development goals which are which are added into the list. But then there are many of those development goals cannot be achieved without us looking into the trivial matters inside it. For example, environmental development, environmental sustainability is a part of the SDGs, but it cannot really be achieved without animal rights or animal advocacy or animal welfare. What about those goals or those actions which need to be taken in account for? Because even if they have been a part of it or a mini part of it, member states have not really agreed to it, and in their own nationalized governments, they're not really taking care of it. What about those things?
Okay.
I think I have the last question for this round, but I'm interested in learning what you feel has been the reaction or feedback about the summit for the future from governments as well as the general population. Or do you think people are hopeful about it? Do you think that there's been a lot of criticism, ambivalence? You mentioned outer space, and my first thought was I could imagine a lot of people being very frustrated that outer space is on this, considering they say that there are so many issues on Earth. So I'm just wondering if there's not broad buy-in, then obviously not much is going to be able to get done. So I was wondering what you thought kind of this current state of buy-in is and what you think the potential is for the summit.
Yeah. Okay, wow, they're getting even more complicated. The first one is BRICS. Okay, no, regional organizations. No, absolutely. BRICS is made of member states, right? And then in the UN here, but also in New York, there's a lot of work that gets done through coalitions. So there's GRULAC, which is the group of LAC. Then there'll be BRICS or G20 or the African group. So those regional setups, and sometimes they're organizations, sometimes they're just groups, are actually used as in our consultation processes in trying to get buy-in. So we will always use champion countries or chairs of to try and get other member states to move along. So definitely on the BRICS specifically, I don't know if the question is maybe more political. I don't know, maybe not. But as you know, there's been a lot of, no, not a lot, but there's been an conversation around BRICS and expanding BRICS and what's behind the expansion of BRICS. And I think in that there's always two sides. I mean, the Secretary General in particular, I can tell you, has been a very big champion of regional organizations, of regional setups. So in fact, now you may have seen that in Haiti, it's a Kenyan peacekeeping mission that's going. And the Secretary General always, since he's joined, has always been very strong about saying, we should support regional mechanisms. So African peacekeeping operations or, regional peacekeeping operations, not always come in from the UN, as a way also of supporting local solutions or regional solutions. Not that the Kenyans in Haiti is one, but it's, not always holding the ball maybe. The flip side of that, and it has been in some of his speeches, is are these centers of power becoming new polarizing centers? By putting everyone in this room, are you actually trying to take them out from the other room? And that he has called out as a risk. And that's why he keeps saying, we should all go back to the UN as the one big room that holds everyone together and avoid these divisions. Okay, now I forget what was the second one. Okay, animal rights. I don't know if you've looked at all the SDGs. You have, and you've identified that there isn't anything on animal rights.
It is not exactly about animals.
Okay.
It will have a majority of the idea of, it will have the majority of the idea of environmental laws and how it should be a part of the planet. But when it comes to nationalized governments, and because as you say that they are to be seen with they have to be agreed by the nationalized government, and the UN works hand in hand with the nationalized governments. Nationalized governments are not really achieving or doing anything about their animal rights. So it is not really a part of the SDGs as animal rights or animal advocacy in order to safeguard them. They still see it as a commodity. They do not see it as an environmental, or it's not a strong idea. It's not a
not as strong as you'd want it to be. Okay. And I'm sure there's many issues like that. You've picked up on this. There'll be others. So maybe I'll say that, first of all, it's a consensus agenda. So it's what everybody could agree on. But it's also not a detailed agenda. The SDGs don't go into an nitty-gritty of every issue. They're supposed to be this broad thing that we all speak to. And then, as I said, every country is supposed to do its own plan. So there's room in that, to address more specific issues. So I'll say, but the second part is, and we've seen it actually, these were done, as I said, 7-8 years ago, and the world keeps changing. So there's always time. That's where I think the civil society position comes in. Why? That's it. We don't have to accept them the way they are. We can also challenge them. We can also ask that there be more focus on one thing or on the other. I mean, you mentioned animal rights, but recently there's been a lot of push to have right to a safe environment be recognized. That's new, right? And it's a lot of civil society. It was all civil society with the support of a special rapporteur. And so that's where I'm thinking, okay, if that right had already existed and that recognition maybe would have been stronger in the SDGs, but that doesn't mean that because it's not in the SDGs, we're not going to look at it. No, the SDGs have to be in reality. So it may not be there. Totally agree with you. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a focus, but it will require civil society engagement, maybe partnering, if not with the UN, but let's say with a bilateral to push a policy on the state. So if you were like coming to me here in Costa Rica and saying, we want to work on this, I would say, okay, let's get a coalition together. Who's pushing it from civil society? And then let's go and talk to the Ministry of Agriculture and Husbandry, and let's get FAO in. That's how I would look at it here. Summit for the Future. Okay, so Summit for the Future, actually, that's my homework. Some of the things you've said. We've just had a webinar with all the resident coordinators, and we were actually told, okay, right, now you, resident coordinators, your job is to socialize the Summit for the Future, hold consultations in your countries so that everybody's aware of the Summit of the Future, but we also hear how people feel about the Summit of the Future, and get member state support. So you need to get Costa Rica excited about Summit for the Future and supportive about Summit for the Future. So that's the state of play. Getting to the Summit of the Future also needed a lot of that. Maybe just a few things around that. For sure, some of the processes that come out of New York tend to be in a more diplomatic arena, and not always the person who represents Costa Rica or any other country, the diplomat that's sitting there is the most connected person to their country. So that, as I was saying, there's this flow. Hey, we're talking Summit for the Future. Is this interesting for us? Is this useful for us? And that's also what means being part of a multilateral. Costa Rica, and I was saying this yesterday, is a very strong voice on issues that have nothing to do with them, but are good for the planet. Let's say environment, of course, has to do with them, but they are, I think in English, it's punching above their weight. They talk about many more issues than what is strictly their national agenda. But I'll give you an example that I always give, which is the ambassador in New York is a super strong voice on limiting artificial intelligence on the use of automized weapons, which is, again, one of those very real issues that we don't see as much. We don't maybe think it's the most urgent, but it's definitely very scary because we had a meeting here. So this basically means the future where weapons will be robots that will act on their own without a human behind it. You know, they will just be out there on their own, like in movies. This is happening already, by the way. And so there's a whole coalition around trying to get a convention, a law passed, something that limits this. And Costa Rica is a very strong voice on that. So a country can play multilaterally on many things without necessarily saying, oh, does this apply to me, in a way? But Summit for the Future, are people excited? Not yet, but most people don't even know about it yet, in a way, because it's just kind of been shot out from New York. So that's what we need to do. We need to get excited. But let's say maybe, the UN did 70, we had the UN 75, a few years ago. We have so many 75. This year is 75 for the Human Rights Declaration. But when we did UN 75, we did this really global poll. It was very public, very global. And I think the few questions like, how do you feel about the world? Is it better or worse than what you think? How do you think about the future? Is it better or worse? And I think a lot of people were surprised how much worried optimism there was. And I think maybe some of the future also comes from that. I have high expectations for my future, but I am worried about it. And I know that we need to work to kind of fix it. And to me, if I had to sell Summit for the Future, no, I have to sell Summit for the Future, I will sell it that way. It's looking at the big challenges. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from climate change is that it is the time to look at outer space. Definitely because eventually it will hit us and we're like, oh, we hadn't seen this coming. No, we have seen this coming. So what I really appreciate in this effort is that it's looking at the daily, food systems, education, but it's also trying to put these bigger topics on the agenda. And the other one that's in there very strongly is artificial intelligence and internet and trying to get, more, I don't want to use the word control, but I think what the word is actually compact. They're trying to get a compact signed by all member states on some basic rules on internet or kind of on our web space. And so maybe a few years ago, nobody would have thought about it. And suddenly like, oh my God, artificial intelligence, this is crazy. We need to kind of fix it. And I'll stop here because I think this is a perfect example of what the UN is. The UN picks up on an issue, early, late, in advance, and then says to the world, okay, we need to worry about this. And then tries to put them in a room and say, let's get to the best possible standard. Artificial intelligence one, plastics. Now, just like, Nairobi, all member states came together and the UN is pushing, and it'll take years, like the climate convention, to say, what can we all agree on plastics, reducing its use, recycling, et cetera, et cetera. So if what is the UN for? To me, it's always this, bringing member states together to try and reach the best possible goal on on issues. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, we've got our 3, and I still have time actually. Okay.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about education, which is the area that I'm interested on. And studying the Sustainable Development Goals, I really feel that target 4.7, which is educating for sustainable development and like human rights, it's very key because you're like changing the culture in order to make all the other changes. And so I wanted to ask, how is this target coming here in Costa Rica? And if you feel like it's, if you even have some civil society organizations that are doing this kind of work to recommend, so I can look up for them. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So I have big question about how environmentally sustainable this is, especially regarding to number 8, which cannot go along with most of the others, so they kind of contradict each other. 8 probably contradict many of them. And also, sorry for the class that this question keep repeating, but because I couldn't find anything online, I really was wondering how the impact of the industry on that decision of the 17 goals influence it.
Okay. The third one. Oh, there.
Hi, thank you so much for your time and kindness. Also, on the lines of Dana's question, there seemed to be some contradiction and stress between some of the goals. And I am wondering if by we all aiming at some standards, aren't we standardizing the word itself, and we are going to lose diversity as peoples and so on. And one contradiction, I do feel very important, the introduction of well-being, but we got to get into this rush of economic growth, and we got to get into the rush, and we are not into the rush, we are not developed. And why do we have to keep pushing into this madness that has actually driven the world into the conditions, environmental conditions that we are? What is wrong with an agrarian society that doesn't need or want to have internet access? Why are we going to force them in the name of development to abandon their quiet and peaceful ways of living because we deem them underdeveloped because they don't reach the standards that the Western and the industrialized countries want us to meet, so their economies keep going as they go? Because in the end, the P5 and the industrialized countries are magnificent for saying lovely things that they are not willing to fulfill, like the rule of law. Yeah, let's make a rule of law, but let's give these five guys the power to not implement the ICJ rulings or wage war whenever they want, because they will block by the veto any resolutions. So are we really not leaving anybody behind? Are we pushing people into this crazy rush in more and more? Well-being is a little bit more and more trying to escape the current rush of the economic madness that the developed countries started. Are we really seeing all the sides of this story? Are we standardizing the word? Are we, in the long run, eliminating diversity and ancestral ways of living that have nothing wrong?
Okay, I'm going to start with this one just because my thoughts are fresher. First of all, my answer is I hope not. I mean, and it's not a wrong question. Obviously, the SDGs are political. Everything that member states do is political. But the SDGs, I mean, guys, they're not, I mean, they're very important, but they're not something that everybody is looking at the SDGs every morning and saying, oh, we have to do the SDGs. Far from it. So just because it's in the SDGs doesn't mean anybody or everybody is doing it. And maybe I go back to the SDGs. I don't think they're a straitjacket, and I, who have to defend them, don't apply them as a straitjacket in Costa Rica. I say this is a matrix for development. This is a route. Costa Rica, how does it apply to you? Oh, well, I need better roads, but I have amazing industry. Okay, forget that one. I have, great gender equality, but I really need to fix education. Okay, then let's focus on that. So again, every country, I feel, has the power to say this does not apply. Reality is countries are over saying this does not apply to me. So the reality of the SDGs is that more and more, most countries are saying, no, I don't want this. No, I don't need this. No, this is not for me. So in reality, so while you feel like, oh, are we standardizing? They haven't been that powerful to be able to do that. And I think it's important. And if I look at practices, as you know, are we protecting practices? And I'll speak of Costa Rica, and I look at the environmental SDG. There's a lot of work happening in Costa Rica to something that's called Pago por Servicio Ambiental. It's payment for environmental services, which is all about recognizing how women in indigenous territories have been protecting their land and have these incredible practices that we need to support. Do governments always want to support them? It depends. Do they want that land? So that's where, if Brazil, that's where the issue comes in. Oh yeah, it's amazing to have you protecting, but actually that land is really interesting to me. Or here in Costa Rica, a lot of land is missing. I mean, indigenous people have rights to a lot more land that is not under their control. So we do a lot of work supporting what they call recuperadoras, which is women that have recuperated. Do you say that in English? Recuperated, reclaimed. I think it's the word reclaimed land that is theirs by law, but not in practice. So I think that's something we need to be aware of, and it's important that you call it out. Careful, guys. We cannot all be the same, and we shouldn't all be applying the same thing. And that is how the UN goes into this, saying if you go back to what the DSG said in that thing, it's every country based on its capacities, based on its vision of development. Is there a contradiction? I think yes, of course. It's very hard to get 17 and to get them all, because ultimately there's one budget, one national budget. So every government, even the UN, where do I put my money? There's constantly tensions. Should I put more here? So in fact, one of the things the UN is working on now, it's called accelerators, which is, okay, we've done a lot of research, not by me, but by scientists and development experts, to say, if I invest in quality education, it's my best chance to achieve gender equality or decent jobs. So it's identified into this some entry points that get to something else, because giving equally to 17, it's not going to work, basically. Plus, nobody has the resources. So it's like definitely choosing one to help the other. Is there an inherent contradiction? I think it really depends on how you apply it. I mean, basically what you're arguing is that growth cannot be sustainable. Growth isn't sustainable in a lot of places, but can it not be sustainable at all per definition? I mean, development experts to the challenge. I argue here that it can, and that we should not pursue growth when it's not sustainable. That's what the UN is saying. It's not saying, please go growth, but make it sustainable. It's like, don't pursue it if it's not sustainable. And by the way, a word that doesn't show up, it's inclusive. Every time I adapt this, I always say sustainable, inclusive. Those two things are not the same. You can be sustainable and not necessarily inclusive. But let's give an example here. Fisheries. There's a huge debate in Costa Rica on making sustainable fishery. And, this government is very much into growth, probably more than the previous government. And so we often have conversation like, oh, but this is going to be sustainable fishery. And we go back and say, is it? Let's look at it. Let's look at different ways that maybe can address it. But let's not forget that there is a real issue of poverty. And, today the conversation is sustainability a luxury for some countries? And in this region, and even here in Costa Rica, we've just started again the debate around exploration of oil and gas, where the president has come out and said, oh, actually, I think we should go back to this. And I think what's interesting is how many voices spoke in favor. And you'd think at this day and age, a country like Costa Rica going back to oil and gas, but a lot of people saying, I'm tired of being poor. And if this is going to give me resources, I'm going to trade, a little bit of sustainability for a little bit more economics. I'll translate that. Parallel conversation that, again, a lot of people are having is around security in El Salvador, which could apply also to Costa Rica. Are the measures being put in place by El Salvador, which have given incredible results, right? For some not, but for millions of Salvadoreños that today are saying, I can finally walk out of my house and sit in the park, they'll trade human rights. So the reality of the world is that there's always going to be trading, and everybody's going to have to say, well, I need this more than that. And that's unfortunate. And actually, as we go into the Declaration of Human Rights 75th anniversary this year, this is the conversation. Why have we developed in people this idea that you have to choose? You can't have them all. So by definition, you won't be able to have 30 rights, so just choose what's more important. How do we go back to say, like the SDGs, they're supposed to be indivisible, and you're supposed to be able to work for all of them? Not easy, I agree. And growth, sustainable growth is... You think it's impossible, sustainable growth. Okay, but then what would you choose? Do you choose growth or do you choose sustainability? And if you're a leader of a government with poverty and unemployment, well, how do you make your choices? Or what options do you give to those people? I'm going to be fully sustainable 100%, in whatever vision that means to you. You could, yeah. And what about the other issues? Because the planet needs less people, maybe. I don't know. But when you have one country in front of you, and that's why this graph is the way I represent it, is because it's very hard to just say this is the one. And so actually now I remember there was a third question, which is human rights and education. And maybe education in general, because how are we educating people? Is the investment in education the biggest investment? Many will say yes. Actually, many will say girls in education is the biggest investment that you can make of all of them. How is human rights? Okay, maybe speaking specifically about Costa Rica. It's actually Costa Rica had a very strong human rights tradition. It's something that it's a bit at risk right now. So we are working on with the Ministry of Education to try and protect that, but there's definitely not enough human rights education in schools. So it is an issue on the agenda. And as I said before, there are very strong forces at work that don't want to see human rights education, or even human rights education, or even sex ed, for example. There's a big program here in Costa Rica on, I think it's called safe relationships, and respectful relations, something like that. And actually, we've done a lot of studies to show how that's brought down the level of teenage maternity rates, unwanted pregnancies. And yet, even that is being quite strongly challenged. So there is, for example, a proposal of law in the assembly right now, a law project that's being proposed by a part of some of the diputados, which is kind of to take out any form of human rights education or kind of progressive education as it's been seen, because maybe one word you've heard a lot in this region is this ideología de género, which is ideology of gender. And so again, this is something that's really coming out, not from ultra conservative people, whoever they are, from the assembly. It's from within the assembly. So something that is absolutely necessary, but that's something that's not always easy. Maybe one thing also specifically is that maybe for those who are more interested in these issues, also, because you work a lot also on press freedoms and hate speech, UNESCO put out a guide. Actually, we launched it right here in this room, the global guide, which is on addressing hate speech in education, and it's guidance to teachers on how to integrate that in their curriculum. I don't know, we have time for one more. Maybe one more question. 4 minutes left. Yes.
From Muna, we have the question, but do we have the same understanding of sustainability? Why should someone reserve resources for future generation prosperity while he cannot utilize these resources for subsistence and basic need fulfillment?
That's not something I answer. That's a debate. That is a huge debate about, but I think, again, are we worried about the today, or are we worried about our children, or even what's around the corner? I think both are valid. I'm sorry, but your point and his point, or her, sorry, are both valid, because we need to think about the future. Actually, I think, what is the UNDP put out? The UNDP has a human development report every year. It has every year, it has a theme, and I think it's now, 2 years ago, the theme was La Era del Anthropocene, where basically, man now is the force that's basically destroying the world. And so we have to recognize this. So I absolutely agree that we need, personally, and I'm only going to give a personal answer, I will always push for sustainable development whenever and however, but I will also recognize that the growth is necessary in certain economies, maybe not in the US, but in a lot of other places around the world. There's the issue of climate justice. That's really important. And it's very easy for maybe most of you in this room, and definitely me, to say, oh no, well, let's stop using this. I mean, this is, again, it's a bit basic, but it is really true. So I'll give you an example from this region. We have Guyana. Guyana has found huge reserves of, I don't know if it's oil or gas, or one of the two. And, it said to the world, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it. And I don't know how many people, including the SG, went and said, oh, please, can we not? Barbados, please follow what Mia, the Prime Minister of Barbados is saying to the world. You don't want me to use it? Give me the money. Give me the money. Is anybody giving them the money? No. So, it's sometimes, it's easy to say, but as you were saying, it's so easy to preach, please don't use it. I've used it all, but you please don't use it. And then when the other person says, fine, I won't use it and help me, feed my people. No, sorry, I have my own problems. I have to buy more weapons. So the world is, and I'm not here. So again, I hope it was a good conversation and there's no easy answers. Everything is tensions and dilemmas. And please look at the UN as just one organization that is trying to at least pull people together to have that conversation. I think, and ultimately, every time the GA happens, we always get the feedback, and they always say, well, this many people came, and they're always so happy. The success is how many heads of states, but also how many civil society, or how many youth, how many women, how many different voices. So if there's one thing the UN really stands for, I think, is like, we need all these voices to be heard, and we are the host in a way. This is the room when everybody can come in and have these really big debates that we are having right now. Happy UN Day. Are you celebrating tomorrow? Yes. Okay. Read the preamble. Oh, that's what we're doing too. Good. But I think it's also, if you have some time to have a big debate, you should have a big debate, because it is an organization that is alive. One of the options the SG is putting there is 2.0, which is how do we reform? We're always reforming, and people criticize, another UN reform. But I feel UN reforms are the way that we stay alive with what's going on in the world. And so critical voices. And I've also picked up a few points from you today. So really, thank you very much.